we've talked about Wind Up Girl, your multi-award nominated winning first novel, and we've touched on Shipbreaker, which is your YA. I understand that Shipbreaker kind of surprised you. You weren't expecting that story to come up.
I was working on the Wind Up Girl, and I'd been working on it for several years, and I was pretty burnt out. And at one point I sent a version of the Wind Up Girl off to my agent to take a look at, and I wanted to give her sort of a heads up about what she was going to have to deal with. And I felt bad. I felt like, you know, if she wanted another bailout point, this was the moment to kind of give it to her and just be like, just so you know, this is what I'm working on, because if you hate it now, you're not going to like it any better later. And in the meantime, I decided to write something else. And my wife had actually been talking to me a lot about how she was having she was having a hard time getting some of her students to read, and especially her boy students. And so I started thinking about, like, oh, well, what do I have in my book collection that I would give to her kids? And I started rooting through my old science fiction collection, all the books that I used to love, and a lot of those were the Heinlein juveniles. You know, it was Have Space, Will Travel, It's Citizen of the Galaxy, Starman Jones, things like that. And what you saw was that some of those hold up okay. Citizen of the Galaxy is still a pretty decent read even now. Have Space, Will Travel is just ridiculously dated now, and
it's hard sometimes to go back to the books you adored.
Yeah, it's painful. Yeah, and so one of the things I sort of started thinking about was like, well, if boys aren't reading right now, part of the reason seems to be our fault within science fiction, essentially. Science fiction was always, I'm beeping here. Science fiction was always the starting point for me as a reader. It wasn't any quote literature. It was the trash, and yet our trash has become very grown up. Our science fiction sort of space has become extremely grown up, extremely erudite, extremely self-referential in many cases. It's sort of difficult to really get the full value of Charlie Stross if you haven't also read Neal Stephenson and William Gibson. That timeline of development is really important. And so I started thinking about, what does entry-level science fiction look like today? Like, what would that be? And if you're going to do entry-level science fiction now, you don't actually put it in the science fiction section. You put it in the young adult section. Yeah, so I started poking around with a couple of ideas, and it was interesting because I knew I wanted to sort of model on something like Citizen of the Galaxy, The Boy Who Learns Better. I knew I wanted to write about the environment. I knew I wanted to write about certain sustainability issues, and what actually ended up happening was I wasn't exactly sure of the scope of the story or exactly how it would work, but I remembered I had recently seen this video about Edward Burtynsky, who's a photographer, and he takes photographs of the most fabulous, bizarre landscapes and the strangest sort of human-affected landscapes in the world. And one of the places he'd gone to was Bangladesh, and the shipbreaking yards of Bangladesh. And the photos he took there were so epic that I started thinking, oh, this is the spot where I want to work. This is something I want to use. And so the story starts with these kids working on a shipbreaking operation in the future, where they're tearing apart all these old oil tankers and freighters, and it's all the last pieces of the oil-burning age. They call it the accelerated age. But that was really powerful to me, and so having that there as one central image was all that rust and all that oil and all that child labor as these kids are working to tear this thing apart. And then I had this other idea. It's like, out on the ocean they can see other better lives going by, and there are these beautiful high-technology clipper ships out on the ocean, and they've got high-altitude parasails, and they've got hydrofoils, and they're fast and they're sleek. And I really wanted to work with ideas of technology where you say, I want to make a sustainable technology look just as sexy as a Ferrari. You know, that sort of, I want it to look aspirational in some ways. And so that sort of formed sort of bookend ideas for what the story was going to be about. These kids living in rust, dreaming of getting out to something that's beautiful and fast, but also, frankly, wind-powered.
Not rusty, very clean.
Right, exactly. All clean tech, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that actually, and suddenly the book just started to write itself. And I wrote it in about 6 weeks, front to back. You know, it was done. It wrote itself. I knew the characters. I knew what they were supposed to do. I knew how they were going to interact. The next chapter was always waiting for me to get to it. And it was probably the most sort of exhilarating writing experience I've ever had. So.
That's cool. We're going to go from the most exhilarating writing experience you ever had to a dark, guilty secret. You confessed in the last panel that you read Gossip Girls. What is with that?
It's good. It's actually almost perfect. You've got these, and there's a bunch of different layers to it too, because you can't quite. Okay, the first thing about the Gossip Girls is that they're such awful people, and they're so delightfully awful and also pathetic as they sort of bang up against each other and just do terrible things to each other and stab each other in the back and cheat on each other and everything. But you know, interestingly, they feel like protagonists to me, people who are actively involved in doing whatever they're doing. And I contrast that with something like when I read Twilight, which I had a much harder entry point to, where I couldn't ever quite identify with Bella. I'm actually a sucker for romance stories in general. I love them. I just love them.
Cool.
And it was interesting because Gossip Girl pushed all the right buttons for me as for characters that I could really connect to, whereas Twilight wasn't really doing that, because Bella was never a character, especially in the early stages, that I could really sort of get into and believe that she was driving her destiny. And the one thing about the Gossip Girls is they're always driving their destiny, even if it's awful.
I actually thought it was pretty cool that you admitted that. What do you have more stories planned in the world of either the Wind-Up Girl or Shipbreaker?
I have another book that I'm writing in the world of Shipbreaker right now. It's called The Drowned Cities, and it'll be out in about a year. It's not a sequel. There's one character that will show up again from the first book named Tool. But otherwise it's a whole new cast of characters, and it sort of explores a different set of ideas. I was sort of interested in what made the world fall apart and how people let themselves fall apart, kind of, and so sort of exploring that aspect of the world.
So either book can be an entry point to that.
Oh yeah, no,
series.
standalones, complete
Cool.
standalones.
Very
Yeah,
cool.
I actually am thinking I don't really write sequels. Sequels are the mechanism for sequels is something I don't really understand, or can't really quite pull off. I tried to write a sequel. I ended up throwing it away for Shipbreaker. I wrote 90,000 words. It just didn't work. I threw it away. I wrote a companion novel instead. It was really depressing. So.
That 90,000 words, that talk about heartbreaker.
It was a whole draft. It was a solid, whole, terrible draft. It was very bad.
Other than the companion book to Shipbreaker,
right. The Drowned Cities.
The Drowned Cities. What are you working on? What can we expect to see next?
It'll be a little ways out, but I think actually the next thing that I'm working on is actually a fantasy novel, of all things. I just recently did a shared world project with a friend of mine, Tobias Bacal, and I wrote a novella called The Alchemist. And there are some ideas in there that I still want to explore. I'm really interested in using fantasy to sort of look at some questions about the tragedy of the commons, global warming, but to recast those questions into a depoliticized sort of milieu that allows you to sort of talk about the mechanisms of the environment without actually sort of raising all those red flags and saying, hey, global warming, hey, carbon credits, you know, those kinds of things. But to talk more about how human behaviors impact environment. And so I'm really interested in using the fantasy tropes to try to explore that more.
Okay, we're coming up on the close. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I'm all good.
Okay. Where can your fans find you? On the web, in the bookstores, at cons?
They can find me at windupstories.com. I'm going to be the guest of honor down at Armadillo Con this year.
When's that?
Late August.
Oh, that's good enough.
That's as much as I got. It's all a blur for me. And I'm also on Twitter and Facebook, and I can be Googled up for those. So,
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. There will be screens of that. Thank you very much for joining us at buzzymultimedia.com. This is Jean Marie Ward signing off.